Good afternoon. All right. So I am Brian Dauenhauer. I'm going to speak to you today on why data rocks. And I'm going to present to you a vision for effective data use in physical education. Okay, so let's start out with some buzzwords in education. If you've heard these terms and feel like you have a pretty good grasp of them, I'd like you to stand up for me. So the first one, data-driven decision making. Okay, good. Have a seat. Thank you. How about the next one, response to intervention? Okay, cool. Have a seat. And the last one, differentiated instruction. Got that? Know what it is. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So all three of these things, these are buzzwords. They're flying around in education in all sorts of spheres. And one of the reasons that I put them up here is I was like, you know what? I don't know if physical educators talk about these things as much as they should. That was before I came to this conference. And I started attending the presentations and listening to the keynotes and started hearing these words and figured out that, you know what, there are some PE teachers that know this stuff and they are in this conversation. As a field, however, I think we need to be way involved in this conversation altogether, even to a greater extent than we are now. So I want to start out by sharing an example with you from reading. What are teachers doing in schools to teach students how to read? Well, first of all, a lot of research has been conducted on this topic. How can you teach a child to read? And the research has shown that there's 6 principal indicators of reading success. So what do you think that reading teachers at young ages are doing? They're assessing those to try to get a feel of whether students are where they are on those. They're using assessments that are brief, valid, reliable, and diagnostic. Diagnostic meaning, the most important one, that it shows the teachers where they might need additional support. Raw data, numbers, in and of themselves are void of meaning. They're just numbers, they just sit there. But you can turn them into what's called actionable knowledge, something that you can actually do something with. And that's kind of the basis of this presentation is, what are we going to do with the data? The basic premise of response to intervention is that we assume every student is capable of learning. We simply need to find out how we can reach them. That's the basic premise. What we see here is at the basic level, tier 1, we use the best possible instruction and the best possible curriculum we can give to everyone. That's the blanket. That goes to everyone. But we don't just assume that that's going to work for everyone. We actually assume the opposite. We assume that our best that we can do for everyone is not going to work for some. And instead of just waiting for them to fail, we have something waiting for them in the second level. And again, at that tier 2 level, we're not just saying that we're assuming that everyone's going to respond to that. There's this third tier of intervention too that's there that is the most intensive, most individualized form of intervention that a child can get. So do you see how this is kind of a preventive or a proactive way to approach instruction and curriculum? Is that we're not expecting everyone to respond. We're expecting that they're not, and we're ready for it. This idea of response to intervention infuses directly with the idea of data-based decision-making or data-driven decision-making. The idea that we're going to screen all students to identify the students that may need additional intervention. We're going to monitor their progress to see if those interventions are working. And we're going to have this preventive system in place, ready to go in case students aren't responding. So that was an example from response to intervention, data-driven decision-making, and general education. So let me give you some context. I was a teacher for 6 years at an elementary school. It was the University of Texas Elementary School, a charter school on the east side of Austin that served lower SES community, about 75% free and reduced lunch. Smaller school, and we found a really high prevalence of overweight and obesity, low physical activity, low fitness, and poor nutritional behaviors. And I was sitting there with my administrators and people from the university saying, what are we going to do? And someone spoke up and said, you know what, we're applying this model everywhere else. Why don't you give it a try and see if it works for you? So we started applying the response to intervention in physical education. So we began collecting some more data on students, trying to figure out, and you can think about the indicators from reading. These might be some indicators of overall health. So we started measuring physical activity using pedometers that could hold data for 7 days. We were measuring heights and weights and doing BMIs. We are using the fitness gram pacer test to get an indication of aerobic endurance. And then the 3 here you see here, fruit and vegetable consumption, sugar consumption, and screen time, Those were measured using the School Physical Activity and Nutrition Survey. Along the way, we used technology to support us as we were collecting this data. So down here, we've got the clickers. Instead of having students sit on the gym floor and use paper and pencil, they were in fitness stations, they were doing all sorts of stuff while they're answering questions about their nutritional behaviors. And then we also used the Pocket PC to help with the fitness data collection and stuff like that. So we had these indicators over here on the left, and what we did to prioritize students or identify students is we combined them all into a weighted composite. So those 6 things came together to form a health risk index. And so each student had a number, and you can see we had them color-coded, where the students that were at the least health risk were in the green, students at the greatest health risk are in the red. Because it was a composite of all these things, the students that were in the red were not necessarily students that were overweight or obese. There were students that were a healthy weight, but they were inactive, and they were making poor nutritional choices. They also were identified as students at an elevated health risk. So what did we do? Well, we took the model, the response to intervention model, and we basically reapplied it and started using it to promote this idea of preventive school health. And I'm going to go through each of the different tiers to tell you a little bit about what we did to intervene. So at the Tier 1 level, it consisted of a quality physical and health education program. Remember I talked before about the gold standard? We got as close to it as we possibly could. We said, what does the research say? 150 minutes a week, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing. So we did that. We used some of the resources that are out there. We used Spark. We used Catch. For health, we used the Great Body Shop curriculum. We used all these resources in the Tier 1. And the focus was on enjoyable physical activity and getting that MVPA in, that 50% MVPA. We also had a school health advisory council that met every month and used the CDC's School Health Index, and they were monitoring the environment, the school health environment. And every month would make recommendations about how the school environment could be changed and made more healthy. And then finally, we had these special wellness events, a 5K fun run, an Olympic day, which is kind of like a track and field day, a health festival bringing in health resources. So all of these things together made up the Tier 1. And we assumed that quite a few students are going to respond to this Tier 1, but again, we were ready for a handful of students that may not respond to it. So Tier 2, the second level of intervention. This was called the A team, or the active team. And this consisted of small groups that met 2 times per week for 30 minutes. So the school was already doing this in every other subject area. So they had a scheduled intervention time every day, 30 minutes. If kids needed help in math, pulled. If kids needed help in reading, pulled. If kids needed help in physical education, pulled in the A team. During these small groups, the students checked out a pedometer and they kept it on the whole time they were part of the A team. And every week, they logged their steps and they set a goal for their physical activity for the next week. And so they were monitoring all throughout and setting goals for themselves. They also got to do special projects that would be very difficult to do with an entire class. So let me give you an example. Up here, this visual, this was a project where the small groups went on walking field trips to restaurants around the school, all within a mile of the school, and they prepared interview questions for the managers and for the owners, asking them about the nutritional value of their foods. And they went and asked these owners, and some were honest, and some weren't so honest, but they got the information and they brought it back and they compiled it into this newsletter that went home to parents. And so we had this issue at our school where parents would bring in junk food for lunch for their kids. So the kids actually created this newsletter to show parents where were the healthier options in the restaurants around the school in hopes that they would start bringing in healthier food. This one down here is a photo voice project where the kids checked out little digital cameras. And they took them home with them, and they took pictures of things in their community that they considered to be facilitators or barriers of physical activity. They brought all their pictures back, they wrote captions to show why they thought they were facilitators or barriers, and then they made a bulletin board that was in the cafeteria that everybody got to see, showing what's in my community. Like, for example, a basketball hoop where the rim is torn down, no net, concrete cracked. Or, on the other end, a beautiful park that was just green grass and they're flying their kite in the park or something like that. So they got to share those with the entire school. In addition, there was an open gym time in the morning that they were invited to, 15 minutes, they could come or not, they could use the PE equipment, play, they were supervised, and lunchtime reinforcement. Small incentives where if they made good nutritional choices at lunch, they got a sticker on their little incentive chart. And then they could earn things like a kickball, or they could earn a jump rope or something like that. So this was that Tier 2 level intervention. Tier 3, remember from our pyramid, Tier 3 is the most intensive level of intervention. So think about it in your mind right now. If you were doing Tier 1 and Tier 2, you were doing all that for students, and the students still aren't responding, and these are elementary school kids, what do you think might be the issue? Parents. Yeah, so we said, okay, Tier 3, most intensive intervention, we got to get the parents involved. So first of all, the students went to this after-school program, 90 minutes a day, 5 days a week. They did physical education, they did sport, they did cooking and gardening, and every month, the parents were required to come in and do a parent night. And they would learn to cook, they would learn to garden, they would do family-friendly physical activities, and they became like a little support network for one another as well. In terms of implementation, up here at the top, you can see Tier 1 is happening all throughout the school year. That happens start to finish. Tier 2 begins as soon as we've been able to analyze that data that we collected at the beginning of the year, the beginning of the year assessment. And there's a fall A team and a spring A team as well. And then Tier 3 occurs in the spring semester, the entire duration of the spring semester. You can see the assessment calendar here as well. So if you think back to the reading example, they were doing beginning, middle, end of year assessments. So that's kind of how we modeled it as well. We're measuring physical activity, BMIs, fitness, nutrition, 3 times throughout the school year for everyone. And then we're doing it more frequently for the students that are in Tiers 2 and Tier 3. Remember, they wear the pedometer the entire time that they're in that. So what kind of results did we get? The results were pretty encouraging. So this is showing physical activity from one of the A teams that met in the spring. Look at the number here. That's 5,800 steps on average per day over the course of a week. That's pretty inactive, especially considering the 12 to 15,000 range is kind of what we're looking at for kids that age. Over the course of the semester or the quarter, they were able to go from 5,800 to 8,200 steps. It wasn't where we wanted them to be all the way up, but in fact, it actually got them at or above where some of the Tier 1 students were by the end of the quarter. Aerobic capacity, these are laps on the pacer test. So you can see overall grades 3 through 5, and then you can see the fall and spring A teams and that wellness, the Tier 3 after school program. All saw increases in aerobic capacity, and you might expect that. Kids grow, they're going to get more laps on the pacer test each time. But we also saw increases in the percentage of students that were making the healthy fitness zone in aerobic capacity. Here's one of the coolest responses that we got. So down on the bottom, 2010-2011 school year, you can see how BMIs went over the course of the school year. And they pretty much stayed steady, small decline. Compare that to the top line, which was the year that we were trying to observe and really see what was going on. We saw a 1-point increase in BMIs over the course of that school year. So what happens is that translates into a lower percentage or a lower prevalence of students that were overweight or obese. That first year, 2007, when we were just observing, 63% of the students were overweight or obese, a huge number. By the end of the 2010 to 2011 school year, it was just below 47%, which all you math people out there can see, it's an average of about 4% decline in overweight or obesity each year over a course of 4 years. What were some of the other benefits of having all that data that we were collecting over those years? How many of you know what a staffing meeting is? So here's how staffing meetings worked at our school, okay? Well, no, not staff meetings, staffing meetings, okay? So here's what happens. Administrators, classroom teachers, support specialists, psychologists, all of them would get together at the beginning of every semester, and the teachers would bring in all their data. All that reading data, they had the data for math, they had the data for science, they had everything. And they bring it all in and they put it there, they actually project it on a screen. And the whole team looks at every single child in every grade level and says, what are we going to do for that child? So these meetings went on all the time, and I was never invited into one of those meetings, ever, until I had some data. And then, I wouldn't say I was invited, I kind of pushed my way into these meetings. Finally, I got into these meetings, and I brought my data to the table too. So just imagine you've got a bunch of people that really care about kids, and they're talking about reading and math and science and everything else, and all of a sudden now there's a PE guy in the room saying, well, wait a second, what about their health too? Isn't that important as well? And one of the coolest things that happened out of that was, so this is how I'd get my students. I would present my data and say, I want this student, I want this student, I want this student. But they would have, this one student sticks out in my mind. Okay, this student was struggling in math, struggling in reading, struggling in everything, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to schedule all the academic interventions that that child needed. They're talking after-school tutoring, they're talking come in before school, could we possibly take them out of recess for a few minutes that we can do this other intervention that we want to do? And finally, after listening to that, I was able to step in and say, wait a second, this child is obese, this child is inactive, they're not eating well. Can I have them for a little bit? Forget all the other stuff for now. Just let me have them for a little bit. And they agreed. And they let me have this child. And I started working with this child one-on-one in this case, because actually they wouldn't sign up for the after-school program. Started working with this child one-on-one, and over time, they started to move more, make a little better, healthier choices. And what do you think happened? Some of those other things in the classroom, they started improving without any intervention in the classroom at all. It was just through that. So I got into these staffing meetings, but I would not have been part of that conversation unless I brought the data with me. I had to have something to get into those meetings. Faculty meetings, school board meetings, I presented every chance I could. I brought that data with me. I made it as pretty as I could in those graphs and stuff. I said, here's what's going on, and kept everybody up to date on what was happening in physical education. Now here's the cool thing, the resources and funding. A number of you, I bet, were looking at some of the stuff we were doing and saying, how did you possibly pay for that? Or how did you do that? Well, what happened is when we started presenting the data in all these different places, it didn't matter what the data showed, people started jumping in. At the beginning, the data was awful. I said, look at how awful this is. We got to do something. What can we do? And people were like, I'll help. I would love to help. Then, as we start going through and we start to show progress, people start saying, whoa, you're doing really cool things. How do I get to be a part of that? I want to be on a winning team too, you know? And by the end of it, we had so many people, so many community resources coming out of the woodworks saying, you know, what can we do to help? We want to get in on this. And we actually had to start turning people away saying, we're doing too much. We have to sort of slow down here and pick and choose what we're going to do. And the last thing there, program value and credibility. Finally, physical education was valued. People saw the outcomes that were coming out of it, and they were saying, you know what, that's important. So remember those questions I asked you about reading at the beginning? Is it an important skill to have? Is it something that will affect their life? Is it something that the community values or society values? The answers were yes to those questions for this as well. And what it did is it added value and it added credibility to physical education in the school. Okay, so you may be thinking, but Brian, all you've talked about are all these just health-related fitness things and physical activity. And we're PE teachers, that's important, but we do a lot more than that. And you're right, you do a lot more than that. And these are our 6 NASP standards. So, should we be collecting data on all of these things? My answer is yes, of course we should be. And so we are trying to collect data on other things as well, even though they weren't informing that RTI model that you saw earlier. So you've got here the 6 NASP standards, and then you've got a number of other things. We talked about nutrition already. We talked about screen time. We also started collecting data on competence and enjoyment. So thinking about how confident students were in certain skills and how much they enjoyed certain units. So here's what I noticed. You could have a really, really high-skilled student that thought they were awful. And if they didn't think they were good at it, they weren't going to do it outside of class. Or you could have these really high-skilled students that just really didn't like what you were doing and didn't enjoy it, and they weren't going to do it outside either. So in addition to measuring the actual motor skills, we are measuring competence and enjoyment in addition to that too. And all of these things, all of this data that you're collecting needs to come in and somehow drive instruction. So think about questions that every teacher probably asks themselves. How should I group my students? Who should I choose to demonstrate this skill? Who needs a little extra attention during drills? Okay, we ask ourselves these questions, and a lot of times it's just sort of intuitive, we just do it. but we can also turn to the data that we're collecting and really get a good feel for the answers to these questions. Let me give you an example. So here's a basketball assessment. Okay? Dribbling. Hand on top of the ball, finger pads, head up. Okay? We got a rubric on a 1 to 4. We also have that confidence that I told you about. How confident are you in your dribbling skills? So let's answer the first question. Who should I use to demonstrate this skill? Who? Michael J., right? Michael J., he's got 4s on all of the actual skills, and he's extremely confident. That's the guy I'm choosing to demonstrate when I need a demonstrator. Who needs a little extra attention during drills? Oprah, right? So Oprah, she's getting 2s across the board, and you know what? She really she's not confident at all in her skills. So when we start doing drills, I'm hitting up Oprah right away. Clipboard, table, highlighter. Highlight the students that are the higher skilled, high confident. Different color, highlight the skills that are lower skilled that you might need a little extra attention. Yesterday, differentiated instruction. This is what it is, right? How are you going to change the instruction to meet the needs of individual learners? Okay, some other questions that teachers might ask. Which components of fitness should I focus on? Do I need to revisit any health concepts? How likely are my students to do this activity outside of class? A really big question, I think. So you can look to the data to try to answer these questions. So here's another example. This is now at the classroom level. We've got 2 third grade classes, Mrs. Wilson and Mr. Vaughn. And we've got our basketball unit again, dribbling, passing, shooting, and defending. All of these are confidence scores, and we have an enjoyment too. This is the percentage of students that responded in the positive. I am confident, or I am very confident in my dribbling skills, passing, shooting, defending. The red numbers will show you where a pre-post for that unit went down, and the green numbers will show you where the pre-post went up. In this particular case, we look okay. We're looking at 85%, even it went down. And our numbers are pretty good, but then we get over here down to enjoyment, and I notice that both are red. So I may have increased the confidence, increased the skill of my students, but they don't like basketball anymore. So did I accomplish my objectives? Are they likely to keep doing this outside of PE? My answer may be kind of questionable on this one. So as a teacher, I'm looking at this data and I'm saying, you know what, the next time I teach that unit, I might need to do something a little different and make it a little more enjoyable because it wasn't quite where I want it to be. So this is not crazy. This is not something that's way, way out there. Data use, effective data use in physical education is expected. NASPE, our national organization, physical education teacher evaluation tool. It says student performance is continually evaluated to guide instruction. This is the initial physical education teacher education standards. Effective teacher candidates use assessments and reflection to foster student learning and inform decisions about instruction. This is there. This is an expectation for all of us. We also are now getting unprecedented access to the technology that can help us do this. I know that we teach lots and lots of students, and we need some kind of efficient, feasible way to be collecting all this data. We have management systems that are out there now. I was just in the FitnessGram presentation earlier. These systems are being developed to help us collect this data and help us get the reports and analyze it. It's coming. And we also have the other kinds of technology to make the data collection, the assessment, actually feasible and manageable. So, I strongly believe that data-driven decision-making is best practice in physical education. Not just for accountability. We talk about accountability a lot, and it's important. But we also need to be using data to drive inquiry and reflection as educators. We need to be using it to drive program improvement and make the changes that need to be done. And we really, really need to use the data for advocacy, to show everybody that we do something that is important and that nobody else can do. Okay, so we can't be totally hunky-dory about all this. There are some dangers along with this, and you may see these dangers happening in other subject areas. Assessment at the expense of instruction. You just assess, and you never teach. Teaching to the test, which goes along with the next one, narrowing the curriculum. All you teach is what's going to be tested. You don't worry about anything else. A deficit perspective. Looking at the child as having something wrong with them that you need to fix, rather than the opposite, which is there's something not right with our curriculum and instruction that we need to fix to meet those needs. See how you could easily fall into the other side of it? And finally, unfair teacher evaluation. So we have to be very careful at how we're evaluating teachers and not completely going overboard to say, you know what, if your child's not fit, you're a bad teacher. It's just the way it works. We got to be careful of these things. However, one of the coolest things right now is we are not stuck in all those systems that are already in place, all those mandates, all those things where schools are required to collect this data and report it in this way and do it this way. All those things, we're not involved in that. So we now get to choose our own destiny. We get to choose our own path as to how we're going to use data to drive what we do as educators. And we have endless possibilities on how we can do it. So I want to leave you with a quote in closure from a very wise lunchroom monitor. He said, "If a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we should teach the way they learn." Thank you and have a good rest of your time.